Alrighty, so I've got my first deck guide of the set 4 cycle. I'm going to be breaking down Quinlin Tarkintown for you. This is a very good deck, a deck that has existed in previous metas and got a lot of upgrades in this set. So I've got a lot of high hopes for this archetype. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button if you haven't. And if you're looking for some more content from me, including live updates to this deck and a lot of others, do check out my Patreon. There's a lot of content up there right now. All right, so here's the table of contents. Question 1, which I'll answer right now, is this a real contender? Yes, I believe it is. If the question is a real contender in tournament play? Yes. For tournaments, I think this is going to be a deck that competes well. It has game into some other top archetypes that we will talk about later in this guide. It's a proven commodity. It has already performed well in the previous meta and has gotten new help in this set. It is a very sturdy deck. So yeah, I think this has got what it takes to compete. I will be talking about like the overall theme of Quinlan and Tarkintown and why we're playing these things. We'll be breaking down the deck list card by card. I'll be going into a 2-drop deep dive, which is a hot topic when it comes to designing a Quinlan deck. Talk about the leader strategy with the pings and when to flip and how to utilize it. We'll talk about managing breakpoints, both when it comes to managing base total breakpoints and also unit thresholds. A little bit of a conversation about when to pass and when not to pass. A common question I have seen when it comes to gameplay with Quinlan. And then we'll pivot over into Ahsoka and Qi'Ra and follow that up with the discussion about hand hate and hand targeting in this deck. It's primary, which is the primary mode of disruption for this archetype. We'll kind of cap this off with a conversation about a few matchups. Not going to do a giant deep dive on all the matchups because, we're still incredibly early. I don't have data to suggest what decks I should be talking about. There's just a few that I kind of know I should be talking about. And then we'll wrap up with the sideboard and other considerations in future building for this deck. And as I said, I will continue to iterate on this. All live updates are provided on my Patreon for this deck and others. All right, so why do we play Quinlan? Well, a few things. Let's start simple here. 3/7 is probably the most powerful leader stat line on 5 resources. Very sturdy. 7 is a very difficult threshold to beat. 3 is an aggressively statted power. So yes, he's got the stats. Then he's got the traits, right? Force enables force throw. Now it is the only force payoff in this deck, but force throw is one of the best cards in the game, and Quinlan does the force throwing the best. His ability on his own will triggers Tarkintown, which is another big reason we're in this kind of leader-based configuration, right? I think at this point, Tarkintown is no secret. There's a lot of decks that rely on the interaction with ping leaders or ping units and Tarkintown, right? We know Django does it, Cad Bane does it. It's just very useful when it comes to board control and tempo to have a base that is a free removal. And it's not always free unless you can enable it. But Quinlan, pretty easy to kind of manage enabling a Tarkintown. It doesn't always have to be turn 1. Of course, the threat of a turn 1 Tarkintown does shift the way your opponents may play. They might not play units into you if they have initiative on the first turn, kind of tossing initiative to you, which is okay because you are an aggro deck and you don't hate going first. But yes, so Quinlan, big stats, force enabling, Tarkintown. Now we're in yellow-red, so we figure out how to build a yellow-red deck, and there are some pillars to that archetype. So here's the deck list. The sideboard is covered, but we're going to talk about it in more detail later. And of course, I think the sideboard right now is really just a work in progress. I wouldn't take any card here as 100% to make it. Well, there are some that are 100% to make it in the future, but we kind of maneuver decks as we go. We're not locked into this a month from now. So in that top left, you see the force throw. That is a card that is 100% going to make it. You are never going to see a list. Well, I don't think you ever should see a list that does not play 3 of that card. Force throw is incredibly cheap interaction. It goes into the yellow-red discard package that we will talk about while also acting as removal. Just incredibly, incredibly powerful. In a pinch, you can always target yourself to throw large units at other large units. Hot Shot Blasters gives this deck a little added reach, and in our managing breakpoints conversation, we'll talk about how important that may be. Then we got the 4/2 drops that I am playing: Crafty Smuggler, Green Squadron A-Wing, Leet, and Sabine Wren, but we'll talk about that shortly because the 2-drop conversation is a very interesting one for this deck. We have got Spark of Rebellion, which in conjunction with Force Throw and Ahsoka kind of makes our main deck discard plan, and it is a lot. It is very redundant. So this deck is able to target a lot of decks purely off the back of how powerful chaining discard can be and force your opponents into top decks very early. Surprise Strike, staple yellow card. It shortens the game for us, which is important. This is an aggressive deck. It does not top deck incredibly well after it kind of gets through that turn 5, turn 6. Most of the units you'll see in this deck hit for 3 damage, including the leader. So Surprise Strike, basically adding another unit's worth of attack in one action, really helps. Cassian Andor, the best 3-drop in this deck. I would cut basically all the 3-drops if I was allowed to play like 9 copies of this. But 3/5 is sturdy. It's so sturdy that at some points I consider, and do still consider, just playing other vanilla 3/5s in this deck because it lets you play into Tarkintown decks much more cleanly. The 4 health 3s, which are the rest of them, Ezra, Millennium Falcon, and Red 5, if you're playing Mirror, for instance, you can't lead into a Quinlan with them because then they will play their 3-drop, ping your 3-drop, and then kill it with Tarkintown. Huge blowout. Same happens against Django if they have a P-38, for instance. So the 4 health are a liability against Tarkintown decks primarily because of the ping and Tarkintown interaction. Cassian does not suffer from this, and on top of that has incredible upside. But just because this card has Smuggle does not mean you should automatically be smuggling it. I see this all the time. It is the card I am most likely to want to play on turn 2. So I don't recommend just putting it down there in the resource row just because you can. Ezra is good because he has a lot of upside. The force enabling for the force throw and the potential to draw cards off attack. So he's a solid little beater. He's just a little bit of a liability sometimes in against Tarkintown decks. Millennium Falcon, not a card I'm very often wanting to play on turn 2 because of the resource tax. Of course, the option to sometimes play it and immediately eat a unit your opponent plays, very powerful to be able to do that. Even if it has 4 health, for instance, because Falcon can eat Falcon, right? Falcon can eat Red 5 or all the other 3/4s that may get played ahead of it. So very powerful card, gives us some added reach in that mid to late game where you can when it changes the math. It changes how many actions it will take you to beat your opponent. They might be counting on them being able to race you 3 actions to 3 actions, but your last card is Falcon. You hit them for 3, and all of a sudden you're 2 actions away from lethal, and they're 3, and it changes the game entirely. And Red 5 is a new addition to this deck. Just a solid statted space unit that also works well with Quinlan's ability, sometimes letting you save that Tarkintown for another target, or cleaning up a unit that your opponent may have attacked with. So it's quite nice if this is able to finish off something or just force your opponent to play around it in a very difficult way. Waylay, another piece of interaction we have here. It's been in and out of my main decks for Quinlan starting in set 3. Right now it's in because of the menace of something like Piet dropping big ships. They really do need their big ships to stick so that they can barrage or turbo laser off of them or whatever other removal they're going to use. So that's the primary reason I've included it in the main deck, although it of course works well against anyone piloting stuff or dropping a big unit and to just like delay you. So it's got a lot of utility. Right now I'm opting for it in the main deck. Ahsoka and Qi'Ra, these 4-drops are absolutely crazy, but we are going to dive into them a bit deeper later, so I'll leave it at that. Plo Koon, the monster, the true monster of this deck, the guy that lets you one-shot the 7 health, 5 cost leaders, like Django, Piet, mirror matches. He one-shots the Han leader, of course, even though he doesn't trigger Quinlan's ability there. The leader only has 6 health. Plo is a monster, and he also helps shorten game length if you're ever able to just play him attack and claim. You can represent 6 to 9 damage off of an attack from him with that coordinate online, really shortening the game. Like one hit from Plo Koon changes math tremendously when it comes to closing games. He is a very important part of the Quinlan package. In fact, the Force Throw, the Quinlan, these are cards that are just not very good or as good in a lot of other decks, but Quinlan changing that, it's wild how changing the math from 6 to 7 on a Plo Koon ambush changes the way this deck functions entirely. Commandeer, a new addition to this deck, of course, because it's a card that has just been released. This is a nod to Django being a menace and a deck that I expect to be around in high numbers early and probably late in the metagame. Commandeer is very good against Django decks who try to tap out, right? Play big units. They do something like triple Dark Raid into Ruthless Raider or War Juggernaut, or they just slam them on 6 and you commandeer it. You get to hit them and bounce it back to their hand. Sometimes you get to take it and bash into their Django if it's a War Juggernaut, or take the Ruthless Raider and kill one of their units. It very much changes the math in these equations. It has some utility in other matchups, of course. People are playing a lot of vehicles and space. Sometimes it can be like, take your 3-drop and ram it into your other 3-drop and both your units are dead and I spent 5 resources. That can be pretty solid. So Commandeer, a nice utility card, has proven to be very good against Django primarily, which is expected to be a very popular deck. And last here is Han. I do see right now some Quinlans not playing Han. I'm still on the 3 because I want to win mirrors and I want to win against Han. And Han is good against Han and Han is good against Quinlan. And with the addition of things like Waylay and Commandeer in this deck, as well as Ahsoka and the Hand Hate package, we've actually been able to prolong games a little better than we used to. Even against Django, I've had Han be much more effective in this set than it was in previous set. It was basically an auto resource in previous sets, unless I was planning on force throwing off of it. But now, the game is taking a little longer because they're playing a Ruthless Raider and I'm commandeering it or something. And now we're getting into that 7 turn. And I have been able to play Han into Django, but it's not the primary reason he's there. Like I said, the Han arms race into mono yellow Han is a big deal. The person who can stick their Han will often win. And I just want to have them right now. I could see trimming one. I can't see trimming all. But I like the card. And, you know, if you're playing a mirror match and you know your opponent is not playing Han in their deck, what part of your strategy should be to try to prolong the game to get to Han. Because once Han is out in a mirror, it's very unlikely that the person not playing Han will be able to win the game. All right, let's talk about the 2 drops. We skipped this before. So the top 3 there for me are the core 3. Sabine and Green Squadron A-Ring are the ones that hit for 3 and have 3 health. There aren't a lot of 2 drops in the game that do that, so that's why they're here. I think they're the best 2. I probably wouldn't be touching them, so great. Let's get off of those and talk about Leet. So Leet is Crafty Smuggler with upside, and that's why he's here. You can smuggle him so he can draw you a card late in the game. I like the shielded units turn 1 against some Tarkintown decks, like Django in particular. I think the 2/2 shielded units are actually good against mono yellow Han, for instance, because often they will start with a 3/5 on turn 1. And think about the math this way. You attack their 3/5 with your Elite or your Crafty Smuggler. Now their 3/5 is a 3/3. They have 2 options. They can hit you for 3, but then their guy gets Tarkintown, or they can attack your 2/2 and go down to 1 health. But now if you have any 3-drop in your hand, you can just play it and ping their 3 and get a freebie there. So that's why I like the 2/2 shieldeds into Han. It does not work as well with any of the other units, right? So there's a little upside there. Leet, of course, is the standard because he also has smuggle and he can like release captured units, which happens sometimes against like a Cad Bane. So just a good card. Those 3 I have not really at this time considered moving off of. So the bottom 5 here are the ones that I think there's some play around. You can mess with it. I'm currently playing Crafty Smuggler. I'm not locked in on that. I just think the floor of the 2/2 shielded unit is the highest. The least can go wrong, but also probably the least can go right. It's just the guy that's likely to live into the next turn. And I think that's fine with me. I don't like playing games where like I lose because I have the wrong 2-drop in my hand turn 1, and Crafty is not going to be the wrong 2-drop. It's not really, unless like your opponent literally goes Sabine turn 1 or something, or then you can't really play into it. Red Squadron Y-Wing. This one has a lot of upside, the ability to attack for 4, especially if your opponents are passing into you, which they often will. I think people will learn to pass into Quinlan turn 1 more often than not. And being able to slam this can make your opponent's decision a bit awkward. Anakin Skywalker, 2-3, not a good stat line. I don't like that. What I do like, it has Force trait. It can enable a turn 2 Force throw, so like games where you go like 2-drop into 2-drop plus Force throw, and Anakin could be either of those 2 drops, it doesn't have to be the first one you play, they can result in really big tempo swings. Other than that, if you didn't draw Force throw, he's kind of anemic, doesn't do very much. I don't think I've ever piloted this unit on anything, but I guess you can. But yes, so lots of upside with Anakin, but also a very low floor because vanilla 2-3 is not where you want to be. X-34 Landspeeder, it kills things like Sabine or the Crafty Smuggler and Leets, right? It can trade with a Battlefield Marine. It does some cool stuff. My worry with it is as people learn to play into Quinlan, they will stop playing units turn 1, which means he's less good now because they're not going to give you something to ambush on turn 1. Certainly not those cards that it would be killing for free value. But I think he's solid, right? Like, he still enables the ping, and he has some upside built into him, so certainly an option. And the last one here is R2. The nice thing about R2 is that none of the 3 power units will just be able to value kill him. So like your opponent leads Sabine or something, R2 is solid, right? Of course, if your opponent is leading any unit to drop into, you're often just going to play your 2 Ping and Tarkintown. So like in that sense, none of these units will ever get traded into by their opponent, but R2 does give you some filtering. I've noticed that I don't often use that filtering on turn 1 because you've already kind of filtered your hand with your resourcing, but there are times where you draw kind of a clunker of a hand, but R2 is your 2-drop and you're able to fix it up. You can also go digging for some high impact cards like Force Throw. So R2, certainly an acceptable choice here as well. I didn't include 1-drops on this list. I'm not yet at the point where I think I should be playing them. The problem with 1-drops is they're just worse 2-drops. The only reason you're playing them is to potentially trigger pings against other decks playing 1-drops. But you're usually not going to be able to play 2 in 1 turn because this deck can't really afford to play like 6 to 8 to 9 1-drops. So you're just going to have like a 1-drop in your deck. And against a lot of strategies, you're not going to need that 1-drop, but he's going to be one of your turn 1 plays now in your deck. Like you're not adding more than 12 or whatever it is. And now your turn 1s are going to get weaker a lot of the time. And that's why I don't really justify including them. So let's talk about the leader ability a little bit. So of course we've kind of covered this already, but I want to put a nice like bow on it. So early in the game, you are trying to use this ability to basically trigger a Tarkintown so that you can remove one of your opponent's units, kind of get ahead in tempo that way. That part's pretty simple. Your opponent will do their best to make that awkward for you. That's where this like pass dynamic sometimes happens. We'll talk about when to pass, when not to pass a little later, but that's the general gist. We're just trying to get value that way. Of note, against like ECL decks, a lot of the time, it can be the counter to their energy conversion lab play to basically reset the board. But for the most part, we're just using it to try to kill a unit as quickly as possible. Generally, whatever unit we can. I think you don't need to be saving this all day for some valuable target. Just getting ahead early is often enough. But it does also change some really cool math with like Millennium Falcon I mentioned, where it lets you do trades. Like they play a space unit with 4 health. You can go Falcon, ping, kill. That's great. It can enable red 5 to get some more to like finish off a unit. If red 5 was your turn to play, and then you play something on turn 3 to trigger, and then red 5 can finish it off for a potential 3 damage swing. 2 from the red 5, 1 from the Quinlan. That's really nice, right? And then on his leader flip, of course, if you're sometimes, very rarely, you're able to get like a double trigger on something to finish it off. We will talk now a bit about the flipping, right? Like, what are we trying to set up on our Quinlan flip turn? And a lot of the time, it's one of two things. Plo Koon is the first, but I will want to mention here that Plo Koon is actually not usually the card I play on the 5 resource turn, because people kind of know that it's coming. Generally, a smart player is not flipping their leader into 5 readied resources from Quinlan when Plo Koon's coordinate is online. But you do certainly want to represent this. The best way to do that is usually to flip Quinlan very early in a turn. You don't want to get caught in this like weird in-between where you like attack with a unit and then your opponent flips their leader, like a Django, but all of a sudden, wait, like you didn't flip Quinlan, you only have 1 unit in play. You can't actually do the coordinate, and they will flip if they see the opening to do so a lot of the time. So just flipping your Quinlan already kind of shuts off some options for your opponent, which is nice. And you want to be able to represent that. Of course, sometimes they'll just have another unit that you want to be able to Plo Koon, and that's great too. And sometimes you'll have 2 other units, so you won't need to flip Quinlan. But it is a very sturdy flip, 3/7 stat line. Nothing's really shutting that down. And in like the Quinlan mirror, the person who gets their Quinlan out first and represents that Plo Koon can have a huge advantage. But on the Quinlan flip turn, being able to play multiple cards, especially some of the cheap hand disruption like Force Throw and Spark, is fantastic. I would usually lead Spark if I had both. The idea here is that Force Throw becomes so much better the less cards your opponent has in their hand. In fact, if it's only 1 card and you know exactly what's going to get thrown, that's like the best it can be. So if you even led with Ahsoka the previous turn and you got a card out that way, and then you can get like 2 more out this turn, you might just put them on 0 by the end of the turn. And then you can still play like a 3-drop or something like a hot drop blaster. And that's very nice on Quinlan the Blaster because it changes math quite a lot. Being able to hit for 5 immediately, going to the next turn, hit for 5 can really help shorten the game. So Plo Koon is a big one. Mass Discard is another, and then you play around with your options. You can often do something like Qi'Ra plus Force Throw or Ahsoka plus Force Throw. You might be able to get a Falcon in there with the Spark and help clean up the board. There's a lot of play, a lot of maneuvering, and the great part here is that Quinlan is incredibly sturdy, so there's not a lot that punishes a flip. All right, managing breakpoints. So let's talk about unit breakpoints. And Plo Koon is the kind of epitome of this, is that he can, as a 5-cost unit, can trigger Quinlan's ping on other 5-cost units, so he can actually hit for 7, the magic 7, to kill things like Django and Piet and other Quinlans. That's incredibly important, but there's other breakpoints as well too, right? Like Han Solo, for instance, on 7 resources, he can actually one-shot something like an Enfys Nest or a Cad Bane, right? You get the extra +1. Of course, if you're going to do that, you would want the Quinlan ping to go off first so that Han Solo won't take any damage back, but it's very, very powerful to be able to change this math. We talked about Millennium Falcon changing breakpoints by just getting the ping and then being able to kill other 3/4 ships, including other Millennium Falcons. Very important when you're managing Quinlan to manage your breakpoints on units. It's as simple too as like something like a Crafty Smuggler being able to ping a 3 health 2-drop and then potentially not even needing to use your Tarkintown if you're not facing a deck that's likely to like buff up their 2-drop or something. You might be able to get a little greedy there because you've gotten to a breakpoint on your unit. The other breakpoint, and a very important thing to talk about with Quinlan, is the base breakpoint. I mentioned this in passing during the deck construction, but this deck hits, for the most part, in increments of 3. Almost every unit in this deck hits for 3, with the exception of the 2/2 shielded units, which hit for less than 3, and then Han Solo and Plo Koon, which can hit for 6, but wait, that's also an increment of 3, so 3. Magic 3. What's 8 attacks of 3? It's 24, which is actually 1 short of killing a 25 health base, something that is actually important to remember. And in general, the increments of 3 or increments of 3, and then you get a 2 in there, right? If you get 1 attack from 2, you get 9 attacks from 3, that's actually 29 damage, and then you're 1 short from the 30 health. So this is something you need to remember because you are an aggressive deck, but you're not a good deck at doing chunk damage unless you do it with Plo, which is why Plo is so important. He like carries mega duty in this deck just to like shorten games, but also just like be the thing that kills all the leaders. So we use things like Hot Shot Blaster and Surprise Strike to help shorten games, and you need to understand that there are games you can lose, not because you don't have enough damage, but you don't have enough damage quickly enough. And you may do more total, you may be representing more damage than your opponent, but it's going to take you 3-4 actions to get there, and they can do it quicker, which is why finding ways to get your big units to hit once, something like a Plo, right? Just get the 6 in if you can. It helps tremendously. It makes things so awkward for your opponent when all of a sudden the game is shortened by an action or two. Hot Shot Blaster on Quinlan, another very important one, because now you have a 5. You've changed the breakpoint math by getting in a 5 and then potentially another 5, right? You're going to likely get 2 attacks in with that Quinlan, so that blaster represented 4 damage. It also represented action economy. Surprise Strike, another big one. So I wouldn't touch something like Surprise Strike in a deck like this, because that's the way you can truly shorten a game, right? Surprise Strike Han, Surprise Strike Plo Koon, you hit 9. All of a sudden, you've created 3 attacks in 1. The game is shorter, and your opponent cannot race you anymore, and now they have to interact with you. A great place to be when you are playing Quinlan. So this math, this stuff, it's very important. It is a weakness of the deck in general that it kind of only attacks for 3. I would love for there to be like a good 4-power unit. K2 was probably the closest one. He is absent from this deck, but we'll mention him a little later. But yeah, like that is just something to consider, something to be thinking about that damage throughout the game and like how many actions is going to take you to finish your opponent off. All right, do we pass? This is a big question. It's a loaded question. This is mostly kind of a joke, but I don't have a spreadsheet that tells you in which matchups are you supposed to pass on turn 1 or claim or like play out on turn 1 or like what hands, but it does vary a little bit with matchups. It does of course vary with what's in your hand, but I will say this, for the most part, too much passing is going on. This is still an aggro deck. A lot of the time I'm just jamming. I'm just going to play my guy out. I will often want my opponent to lead into me if they would be so willing to. So like I might sometimes defer initiative. Certainly in a mirror match, I'm not jamming. Like I'm not giving them the free Tarkintown. I will play something like Cassian on turn 2 because that the 5 health, their 3 drops won't be able to trigger it. So that's fine. Then I can be the first one to play my 4 drop or whatever it is. But I will not play something like a Sabine into them and let them eat it. I would not play something like an Ezra on turn 2 and let them eat it. Same with Cad Bane, although because I don't want the games to be prolonged against Cad Bane, I would likely just prefer to lead with a shielded unit so that they can't get a free kill there. I don't want to just play a pass game with them. Django, I'm playing into them. You will not win a long game into Django. You need to apply the pressure. So most of the time I'm going to be okay, depending on the texture of my hand, just playing into a Django. Against slower decks, for the most part, you're going to play. Against Han, you have to play because you can't even ping their 3 drop on turn 1 anyway. So there's a lot of cases where you should be playing. You should be okay. People have kind of figured out that Quinlan can ping on turn 1, right? I think early on, people were just like, I'm going to play. I'm the aggro deck. I'm playing into you. And then they give you a free kill and then you're off to the races. People aren't going to do that nearly as much anymore. It might mean you need to keep an extra 2 drop in your opening hand so that you can ping their turn 1 play on turn 2. That's acceptable too, especially if it's backed up by something, right? There's not a lot of 1 drops. It's force throw. But if you're playing something like an Anakin in your deck, that can be a very powerful turn 2, like Anakin plus force throw. Or post board, you'll see I do add some 1 drops. So it might change the way that you can play that turn 2 a little bit. But your 2 drops often hit for 3 also. So it's not like they're changing racing that much when compared to the 3 drops. So that's my little Dewey pass segment. I don't think you need to so heavily focus on like getting that Tarkintown trigger on turn 1. There's plenty of other times that you will be able to get it off. So let's talk a little bit about Ahsoka and Qi'Ra here. These are both incredibly powerful 4 drops that deck has access to. Ahsoka fits in much cleaner into the like mass discard part of this deck in conjunction with Spark and Force Throw. And often I will prioritize her if I have access to those cards as a follow-up the next turn. Remember, the exhaust part only works when your opponent has a unit, but there are a lot of cases where you can kind of gauge whether or not that's going to happen. And often one in a very popular matchup is something like Django, where they can do something like TDR or Sneak Attack to play a unit, but they just pulled an event out of their hand. So it's more likely that they're now going to have a unit. And if you're able to Ahsoka exhaust a TDR or Sneak Attack unit, that's huge upside that you can chase sometimes. Qi'Ra, on the other hand, is a much more brute force non-interaction, incredibly powerful in a lot of situations to just break up your opponent's hand, break up what they were planning to do that turn. There are some things you need to look out for when playing Qi'Ra, of course. If your opponent has a ground unit in play that could represent enough damage on her to defeat her, maybe they have Hotshot Blaster and a 3-power unit. Maybe they still have their Tarkintown. That happens a lot with the Django matchup, where you can't just play the Qi'Ra to block their triple Dark Raid, because they will then attack their ground unit into her, Tarkintown it, and then do the TDR anyway. So Qi'Ra is usually the card you try to play more often on exactly the 4 resource turn, unless of course you are backed up by a bunch of additional hand disruption to follow up the Ahsoka. But there are a lot of cases where you can't sneak the Qi'Ra in, and Ahsoka does just front load most of the value. Turn on that force trait as well, so you won't need to flip Quinlan immediately next turn to do the force throw, which can sometimes be beneficial. But both are incredibly powerful 4-drops. I play with 3 of each of them because one of these cards is what I want to be slamming on 4R, and often one of them is something I want to be slamming on 5R as well, with Force Throw as the other card I play. But let's talk about the hand hate strategy. So this is kind of like leaked into other parts of this video, but of course, more hand disruption means better. I don't like a hand disruption strategy that is not deep into it, because we draw 2 cards a turn. You get tons of flexibility in your hand with the resource mechanic in this game. So it doesn't really do anything until you like get the last card. And that is the goal of the Quinlan deck. And it can do it quite effectively with just its main deck suite of Ahsoka, Force Throw, Spark. If it draws like 3 of those cards, 3 discard on the Quinlan flip turn, right? If you did like Ahsoka into Spark, Force Throw, that can often put your opponent at 0 cards if they've been playing a card every turn and not drawing any extra. At the very least, it could put them at 1. It's very powerful. It puts your opponent into a top deck situation, and in those cases, you can be very far ahead. And on top of all this, which has been also mentioned a few times, is Force Throw is an absolutely massive blowout when it hits the last card in your opponent's hand, especially if you know what's in their hand and we're able to like maneuver a Spark to take maybe the card they could play and not the expensive card they couldn't, and then bam, you throw the giant thing at their giant thing, and it's just a wrap. So this is kind of the main deck plan, and then post board, you can do things like pillage, right? I have Jam Communications right now in the sideboard, but there's a bunch of options to like further push this strategy, which is really only something you want to do against slower controlling-ish decks, maybe something like a Piet, where you just want to like keep them from top decking, or even after they top deck, you just like pillage, right? You claim early, they draw 2, you pillage, now they miss their whole turn, that kind of situation. You can do K2SO. There's lots of red cards, in fact, that you could add in conjunction, and you know, too much is too much. I don't know how much you actually need past the core and maybe like a couple extra for some specific matchups, but very powerful disruptive strategy. It is the main disruption angle that this deck employs, right? It is an aggro deck. It does not play really any removal. It has like Waylay and Commandeer as like tempo positive interaction. It has its Tarkintown, which is its built-in removal, and for the most part, it's using units to like maybe get value trades, but mostly go face, and then using the hand hate to kind of mitigate their opponent from employing their strategy. All right, just a few matchups that I'm going to talk about loosely. So we are still very early. The set has just come out. No tournaments yet. just some predictions I'm making. I don't think it's bold of me to say that I think Django and Han are going to be popular and very good in the Django matchup. Removing Django is incredibly important to keep you, to allow you to continue attacking. And Quinlan is one of the few decks that can actually do this without like jumping through 1,000 hoops, right? It's got Plo Koon, it's got Force Throw to chuck a Han at it. So various ways that you can maneuver that. You want to be pushing damage against Django. You're not going to win long games against him anymore. It's just way too much firepower with War Juggernaut and Devastator looming. You need to be able to close games out. Your early game, it's just kind of a puzzle. It's awkward, and every game is a little different, and every Django list is a little different with what 1 drops or 2 drops they're playing. So a bit tough to know exactly how you should be maneuvering those early turns, but that's what the practice is going to help you accomplish. And yeah, you need to treat this as a race game, like you are racing them. You need to finish them off before they can start chaining absolute beaters, and hopefully a commandeer at the exact time that it's needed can help swing a game in your favor. Post board, you'll have some more help as well. When it comes to Han, it's a little simpler in the overall strategy. Of course, the Tarkintown stuff is not, you don't need to like worry about it. They're playing a 3-drop on turn 1 almost always. Your best ones are usually actually the shielded units because of how they profitably beat up on the 3/5s that your opponent might play. It allows you to save Tarkintowns sometimes for things like Qi'Ra or Tech, who's a kill on sight. You need to get the techs off the board. But Han is not a deck that's going to DJ you very often. Quinlan is kind of insulated from that. You want to be playing around Bodhi early if possible. I do resource events, even things like Force Throw sometimes, because when they Bodhi and you don't have anything, they're sad, you're happy. They played a 3/3, not a great look for them. Yeah, Qi'Ra, great at bricking his turns a little bit, messing with their sequencing. It's just a lot of give and take here, but you have all the tools. Quinlan generally can do pretty well into Han. It can pressure the Han, flip turn quite well with Plo Koon, and can push damage a lot. You don't want to start A-Wing against them at all. You will lose the game on the spot if they play a Millennium Falcon. So it is another reason why I like having a ground focus 2-drop suite, because if I was like A-Wing plus like the Y Squadron or something, and then I'm 6/6 and my hand is just space 2-drops, boy, can that look really bad if they start Falcon. Not to mention, it makes you less likely to be able to interact with Tech and Qi'Ra and DJ if you're up in space. So I don't really like playing space units into them, except Falcon. Sometimes a red 5 can be nice, especially if you started with a bot unit into their ground opener, because you can just turn to play the red 5. And because you will always have initiative against them early, it might be able to create cleanup duty against Han. In the late game, it does sometimes devolve into a Han arms race. A big reason why I do still play 3 of the 7-drop Han is for this matchup. They don't usually play 3 because they like splitting them with Enfys, and Enfys is not as good as Han in this matchup when your Han can one-shot their Enfys, and their Enfys can't bounce your Han. And lastly, Piet, which is a new deck, and there's 2 versions of it that I've seen. Blue, which is currently the one I think is a little better, and red, which is definitely the one that like blows you up way faster if it does something like Devastator into Planetary Bombardment. But Quinlan, this is like where Quinlan is like, yes, show me all the hand disruption all the time, everywhere, because Piet is basically the most linear a deck can ever be. They're trying to do one thing and one thing exactly, which is ramp and then play big things over and over again. And then they stabilize in space with things like Barrage and Turbo Laser onto your ground. So hand disruption can brick this deck in many different varieties. They can hit the ramp, especially something like Resupply Carrier to prevent the double ramp. It can hit the only ship they can play that turn, bam, their turn's over. It can hit the Barrage or the Turbo Laser, bam, they can't interact with you at all anymore. So a lot that Quinlan has main deck to deal with Piet. Some other nice things that you can do as well. Plo Koon can one-shot the leader, something that's very important. It'll often happen on your 6-resource turn and their 7-resource turn, which means no Avenger out of blue, no Devastator out of red for an extra turn, which can be all the difference, right? And then post board, you'll have some more help here as well. But this really is a matchup that I think Quinlan should be pretty favored in as currently constructed. All right, let's look at the current sideboard just a little, but do remember that this is subject to change. You'll get all the updates on Patreon if you subscribe there, but Electromagnetic Pulse is a card primarily to bring in against Django. It's really nice that it's just a 1-cost way to exhaust a triple Dark Raid or sneak attack turn, and then has the added bonus of being able to kill things like Kylo's Tie, 7 Fleets without shields, and whatever else it may be able to target. It's just a solid little card. I think it works quite well into Django. Jam Communications is going to be something you bring in against control decks. You can bring it in against things like Han and Django sometimes. Now, they don't play a ton of events, but the events they do are incredibly important. But it is a very swingy card because when you miss, it feels really bad. But it's much more of the kind of card you want to bring in against decks that are relying on like an event to stabilize you, right? Piet's not really ever going to beat you if they can't like barrage you, and Jam Communications keeps that from happening. Bamboozle, number 1, you bring that in against any leader that's a pilot, so that you can have a 0-cost way to one-shot them. If pilot leaders become popular, Bamboozle straight to the main deck. If Sabine with Darksaber becomes popular, Bamboozle, bam, straight to the main deck. It's a very flexible card. It can be used against Han as well to break up his flip turn so that he can't attack, get to 7 that turn. A lot of utility in Bamboozle. Little anecdote, I don't think this card should kill pilot leaders. I think it's kind of ridiculous that a 0-cost card in yellow can do that, but we'll see if that ever changes, and we'll see if it ends up being problematic. Cham Syndulla, this card's really interesting. Now, I think less so actually in Quinlan than in some other leaders, especially leaders that cost 6, but Cham being able to ramp you from on that 4 to 5 sometimes, especially against like resupply decks, get your leader out a turn earlier, so something you can bring against Piet or any other ramp decks. Really cool. But where it actually shines the most is probably against Han. Now, maybe not so, like I said, maybe not so much in Quinlan, but in other leaders that wouldn't normally be able to flip on that turn. Because then even if you get DJ'd, you've at least gotten your leader out. On the 5 resource turn, they resource to go to 6. Bam, you slam Cham. They can flip their leader, but you can flip your leader too. So that's really nice. And in Quinlan, you can play this because on that 5 resource turn, when they want to go to do their 7, you can play Cham, go to 6, which means next turn you can lead with a Han Solo. And if you can lead Han Solo to kill their leader, they're stuck on 6 for that turn, and you put a Han out, you could just roll with the game from there. An extra Commandeer because of how good it is against Django. We'll see that a lot of my current planning is for Django and Han and some Piet. If we need to plan more for things like Kazuda and Sabine, like really hard aggro, we might shift the sideboard or the main deck a little bit, and that is fine. This is why this is a very early iteration. And then I've thrown 1 Mace here as kind of a placeholder card, just 1 extra big unit that you can play in like mid-rangier games that you think will grind out a little more. He's fine. He's nothing special. He could certainly not end up making the cut here. He's kind of a placeholder, but you know, the idea here is just an extra bulky card. If you wanted more discard, you could maybe play like Profundity as like a finisher there. But yeah, lots of options. We'll talk about a few of them here. So like Daring Raid, Electromagnetic Pulse is kind of replacing that for me right now, at least based on how the current meta looks to, in my opinion, to be shaping into, but Daring Raid lurks as a consideration. DJ and Liberated Slaves, these are essentially vanilla 3/5s. The reason I put them both here is if I was going to play them, I'd probably play like 1 of each, because DJ is slightly better than Liberated Slaves because you can smuggle him for 9 in this deck, but he's also unique, which means if you like weirdly drew both of them, you wouldn't be able to go like 3/5 like DJ into DJ. So if I ever wanted just more units that couldn't get Tarkintown, these would be the choices. They might replace something like a Red 5, an Ezra, something like that. Red 3 is a card that in the previous set I was playing it primarily because it helped me race against Sabines. Going something like A-Wing into Red 3 into Falcon meant you would win the race against them. It's a very weak space unit on its own, and it's kind of a hostile environment to be playing a 2/3 space unit for 3 right now. But if metas shift and we need a way to race ground aggro more, Red 3 can help. K2 is the 4-drop that has kind of gotten replaced by Ahsoka in this deck. It is still a strong card, but it's not particularly good into either Han or Jango or like Sabine decks for that matter. So it's at its best as like an anti-control card because it adds into the discard plan, but also plays double duty as a unit that hits for harder than things like Ahsoka and Qi'Ra. And when the discard plan is not fully functioning, he can also blow up for damage. Pillage, I talked about this card. It could be certainly a consideration as another part of the discard plan. Do note that K2 and Pillage both already cost 4, so that is another tension with the discard stuff because Qi'Ra and Ahsoka cost 4, and you get just like a lot of 4s when you try to pivot into something like that. And then Millennium Falcon is another card that I miss a little bit sometimes, not so much because I think it's a great rate card, but just because it has smuggle and it hits for 5. And I mentioned in the Breakpoint conversation that you're attacking for 3 most of the time in this deck, and sometimes just being able to like in these games where you like it's going to be a race and you just go like 6 smuggle this claim, I can now hit for 8 in one action with Surprise Strike to help shorten the game, can be pretty powerful. So Millennium Falcon, certainly a card that I think is good enough to make this deck. It's not fitting in right now. And the last few considerations here are ideas with the pilots. Now, this is not a deck that has that much space in it. There is potential room to play some package like this. Anakin, of course, doubles as just a 2-drop force unit, which doesn't really mean it's like has to be in like a pilot synergy. But Han Solo is a solid card. It's a little all in to just like double up onto one unit, but it can work out for sure. R2 is another card that it also doubles as a 1-drop so that you'd be able to like enable a ping. So if you found room for a card like this, it could pull double duty and like changing the math on your space units, right? Your A-Wings go to 4 health, your Falcons go to 5, or Red 5 goes to 5. All of a sudden that unit can't get Tarkintown with a ping, which is pretty nice. And then of course, if your opponent led 1-drop, you now have a card that you can just slam on 1. Ping, Tarkintown, go to the races. So that's mostly all I got this time. Let me know what you think of Quinlan. Let me know what you think of the guide. If you're looking for updates to this deck and others, do check out Patreon. I'll have live links to all of the decks that I'm working on, off meta and meta alike. But yeah, let me know what you think. And until next time, take care.